Of the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. This is a meeting that is public for the first hour and in camera for the second. For those in person, please follow the health and safety guidelines as per the cards on the table to prevent audio or feedback incidents for our translators. Before we begin, regarding Bill C-244, the committee is still scheduled to meet with the sponsor of this private member's bill and government officials on June the 16th, next week. So we need to decide, we deferred this decision, we need to decide if the committee would like to meet as planned next week, but then to proceed with the clause-by-clause review of the bill in September. And if we do that, we would need to set a deadline to receive written amendments to the bill. And a suggestion of that deadline is 4 p.m. on Monday, September the 14th, 2026. Or the committee could choose to postpone the entire study until September, including the meeting that we have scheduled for next week. But then we would have a gap next week. So is it the will of the committee that we proceed as planned with listening to the sponsor, having amendments due September, and then continuing forward from there? Mr. Leslie.
I'll just quickly reiterate, I think it's a little disjointed. I think we should just come back and start with witness testimony. I'm sure we could find something to fill our time. There's still a number of outstanding motions. And if we are going to move ahead, I'm not sure September 14th or whatever date you said is quite early enough. I think we might need a little extra time to get amendments in.
Okay, anyone else on this conversation? So take it to a vote. Okay, so we'll vote on this. So all those in favor of proceeding as planned next week, hearing from the sponsor, please raise your hands. Okay. And those opposed?
6 to 5 carried.
Okay, so it's carried, so we'll proceed as planned. Thank you for that. So this afternoon, we have former members of the Net Zero Advisory Body here to speak with us as per a past motion of this committee. We have Dr. Simon Donner online, professor of the University of British Columbia. Welcome, Simon. And we have Catherine Abreu, Executive Director of the International Climate Politics Hub. Thank you so much for being with us today. I think you do have opening statements, so you each have 5 minutes to make a statement. We will start with you, Ms. Abreu. The floor is yours for up to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Shannon. And thanks to the members of the committee for inviting us to be here with you today. I'll share my story about why I resigned from the Net Zero Advisory Body. I resigned when it was clear to me that this government would let divisive politics and the interests of a wealthy few who represent a fraction of the economy wash away any progress that we had made on climate in the last decade in Canada, and with it any hope that we might end the decades of broken promises on climate in this country. I started working on climate in 2010, fresh out of university. I've dedicated my entire career to the study of climate change, to proposing and advocating for policies that live at the intersection of climate and addressing people's lived realities, and to building political and social consensus to take action on this crisis. I learned very early on that Canada had never delivered on a climate commitment it had made, despite the fact that by the time I started working, Canada had been making climate promises for decades. And Canada now remains the only G7 country where greenhouse gas emissions have gone up since 1990. 6 years into my career, when I took the helm at Climate Action Network Canada, I started the movement to stop the legacy of missed targets and get Canada to pass a comprehensive climate law. It took us 5 years to help build what then became the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. And in 2020, I was really honored to accept the invitation from the Minister of Environment and Climate Change to join the advisory body that act created. I'm sharing this story to impress on you my personal and professional conviction that the Act and the climate governance regime it builds are essential pillars of any effort in Canada to protect current and future generations and be a responsible global citizen. It was very difficult for me to realize that the Act is not being respected, and that I therefore had to step down from the advisory body that is mandated to advise the government on its legal obligations. There are 61 other countries that have similar climate framework laws in place. There are 28 countries that belong to the International Climate Council's network. It's clear from the examples of these countries that climate governance regimes informed by science and independent expert advice are a growing global norm in a world that's racked by floods, fires, and fatal extreme weather events. But the shredding of environmental policy that this government has undertaken means that Canada is now on track to violate its own law and to fail to attain net zero emissions by 2050. The shredding of those environmental policies, of course, began with a capitulation to what I believe is irresponsible and inaccurate rhetorical politics around the consumer carbon price, which was scrapped as soon as this government took office. And then the climate competitiveness strategy repealed or weakened virtually every climate policy that and regulation that Canada had developed in the last decade. Our clean electricity regulations for 2035 have been set aside in favor of a national electricity strategy that's delayed to 2050 and opens the door to new gas-powered electricity plants, which makes a mockery of the abundant clean energy resources that should be a very celebrated economic advantage in this country. The oil and gas emissions cap has disappeared, making room for the government to use Canadian taxpayer dollars to build new major oil and gas projects and grow what's already the largest and least controlled source of pollution in the country. And of course, zero emissions vehicles mandates have been significantly delayed and weakened, contributing to a dramatic drop-off in EV sales in Canada, right at the moment when soaring gas prices are hurting Canadians who are struggling to fuel their gas guzzlers. Speaking of those soaring fossil fuel prices, rather than discussing a tax to harvest some of the $100 billion in windfall profits that Canadian oil producers are set to make from the Iran war, this government is proposing to grow its subsidies to the industry, extending taxpayer dollars to cover enhanced oil and gas recovery and capitalize a fake sovereign wealth fund. With these decisions, we knew that there was no hope of Canada meeting its 2030 or 2035 climate goals. And now the Ottawa-Alberta MOU weakens and delays methane regulations for Alberta, even though methane is arguably the cheapest and easiest greenhouse gas emissions to control, especially in the oil patch. But most devastatingly, it takes what has been described as a sledgehammer to Canada's industrial carbon price, and that puts net zero by 2050 firmly out of reach. At no point has the expert advice of Canada's legislative advisory body been sought or considered in these decisions. Let me be clear. There's room to change and update climate policies and regulations. In fact, doing so is often necessary, and part of the function of the Net Zero Accountability Act and the Net Zero Advisory Body is to identify where course correction is needed and provide advice on how to get there. But that's not what we're talking about. We are talking about the elimination of policies with no alternative policies or pathways being put in place. It's not just the Net Zero Accountability Act. There are other pieces of legislation that have been put into the crosshairs. It really seems that all of the environmental laws and some of the human rights protections are up for grabs for the sake of building fossil fuel projects that rely on public subsidies because no private investors are interested, and which will likely wind up as stranded assets when the vague Asian markets that are often referred to inevitably fail to materialize. This is my last paragraph, Shannon. Politics south of the border and desire for economic growth are the reasons given for these devastating decisions. But taking a moment to look up from a narrow view of the US, we see the rest of the world is moving ahead on climate. It's a big risk for Canada's economy that our government has decided we won't try to keep up. Canada needs to make climate policy a priority again if we want to stay competitive. The OECD's 2025 economic survey pointed out that Canada's productivity growth has been lagging behind best performing OECD countries for many years. And that's not because we haven't been building enough pipelines, it's because we haven't been investing enough in green and digital transitions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Abreu. We'll now turn to Mr. Donner for 5 minutes.
Bonjour tout. Thanks for the opportunity to appear on your screen here today. I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia, as you've heard, and I'm speaking to you today from Vancouver, which is situated on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. I believe a member of one of those nations is here today. I think so. It's hard for me to tell on the screen. I resigned from my role as co-chair of the Net Zero Advisory Body last December, and I did so with a heavy heart. It was a real honor and privilege to work with the other members, including Ms. Abreu, to provide independent advice on pathways to net zero emissions for Canada. I enjoyed the work, I enjoyed the people, and I remain grateful to the federal government for the opportunity to do that work. As a legislative body, as we've just heard, the Net Zero Advisory Body can provide a unique service to the government. Unlike all the other voices that seek to influence climate and energy policy, the NZAB and its members have no vested interests. You fire the members and they all go back to their day jobs. And so countries around the world, as was alluded to in the last statement, and this includes the UK, across the EU, Korea, Australia, all these countries that Canada is trying to build stronger economic relationships with, they benefit from similar legislated climate councils, similar bodies that also have no need to curry favor to gain access to power. So they're going to be honest with you. The NZAB structure, to be honest, though, however, was never ideal. And after last year's election, a series of structural yet manageable challenges which had plagued the NZAB from its creation expanded into full-blown crises. And I'll highlight 3 of them here. First, the NZAB's work, and this should be obvious, is pertinent across government, yet the body only serves the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, who often, particularly in the current government, is not leading the relevant policy file. And so, for example, last summer, we completed research on industrial pricing and on equivalency agreements with the provinces that was highly relevant, well beyond ECCC. And we volunteered to brief people across government and received no response from the Prime Minister's office and nothing but an acknowledgement from the Office of the Minister of the Energy and Natural Resources. Second point is, in successful climate councils, the work is aligned with government policy timelines. This was the exception, not the rule, for the NZAB. With the one key exception, I'll say, of the 2024 annual report, in which we gave advice on the 2035 emissions target and what can be done to reach the 2030 target. The gap, however, with government policy timelines worsened under the current government. We were not informed of policy decisions underway, nor asked to provide advice on those decisions. You add in the ongoing challenges, structural challenges we had, like procurement rules, slowing our research process, and just the awkwardness of the staff for the Secretariat being ECCC employees that were being asked to work with us at times to critique the government. It became very difficult for us to produce any work of value. And the third point that I'll highlight is that the member appointment process is extremely arduous, and the government simply did not plan adequately in advance. Last summer, the NZAB was down to 6 members. Despite repeated requests from me personally, I received no answers from the minister's office about a timeline for future appointments. By late fall, it had become evident that due to government inaction, I would have to continue chairing an understaffed body without a francophone counterpart for at least another 6 months. And I have to say, this is a workload that was completely unsustainable for me last year. So when the Canada-Alberta Memorandum of Understanding was released, and the private briefing on our annual report scheduled for the next day was canceled by the minister's office, I concluded that the NZAB's work had become performative. And to be clear about this, I was comfortable chairing an advisory body whose advice was considered but ultimately rejected by the government. Because after all, we're not elected representatives like the rest of you. I was not, however, comfortable with the process becoming performative, in which we had little or no opportunity for our work to actually inform policy. And in addition, as the chair of the NZAB and the sole chair at that time, and by rule then its spokesperson and its liaison with the minister's office, the MOU represented a direct challenge to my professional integrity because I wasn't just the chair of the NZAB, I'm a scientist. And I was inundated with requests for my professional judgment on the content of the MOU and the government's intentions with the MOU. And I felt pressured to soften that assessment because of this uncertainty and lack of conversation with the minister's office. That softening my assessment is incompatible with my responsibilities as a scientist and a professor at a public institution. I simply can't do that. That's not my job. Scientists like me only earn a seat at the table because of the integrity of our discipline. I felt I could no longer serve people who I felt themselves were not being honest and forthright. And so I submitted a private resignation letter to the minister, and then immediately afterwards informed the NZAB members, and I announced that decision then publicly a couple of days later. I'll just conclude, thank you for the time, by just saying that this experience, I'm a scientist, and this experience taught me that the goal of net zero emissions is about so much more than fighting climate change and more than climate science. It's about building a prosperous future for Canada. Much of the world is rapidly transitioning to clean energy, as we just heard. And if we don't change our strategy, we really risk being left behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Donner. We will now turn to questions by committee members. And I believe we are beginning with Ms. May of the Green Party for 6 minutes.
I want to start by making sure that anyone watching this publicly knows that I'm only able to ask these questions because the Conservative Party decided to give me 6 minutes, for which I thank them. Let me start by saying, first of all, because I know you both, and I want to extend to you my thanks for your hard work on the climate issue for so many years, to Dr. Donner for standing for scientific integrity, to both of you for a really tough decision, and I know it cost you more personally and emotionally than you're able to share before a committee. So I want to put my question to Dr. Donner. I'm also informed the Prime Minister has never once met with his Prime Ministerial Science Advisor, Dr. Mona Fortier. Do you sense that this government understands the importance of science writ large? You spoke of scientific integrity. Do you have any comments on that matter? How much does this new government understand the importance of science?
Thank you for the question. To be honest, I feel like I can't answer the question because I never had the opportunity to meet with the Prime Minister or heard anything from the Prime Minister's office. And I want to be clear about this, that I'm just one of many scientists in the country, but I was chairing the advisory body. And the NZAB does serve under the Minister of ECCC, and I did have a liaison that I met with in the minister's office. And so there is no obligation for the Prime Minister's office to meet with the NZAB, but I find it highly strange that they wouldn't be interested, because we were doing research with the Canadian Climate Institute that is directly relevant to the decisions that were just made on the MOU. And I'll be clear about it. Our advice would have said, basically the results of the work that the NZAB has done, and our advice would have said that the way they've changed the industrial pricing system, and I don't just mean the change in the headline price and the price floor, that's what's gotten all the attention, but the details, the changes in the tightening rate for the benchmarks, the grandfathering in old permits under Alberta's system. We would have been telling them, listen, this is not going to work. And we can tell you this based on modeling that was done by the Canadian Climate Institute and based on our own analyses. And would they have taken our advice? I don't know. Why they don't want to hear it, I also don't understand. If you don't want to hear from advocates on all sorts of issues, that's your choice. But this is just research evidence, right? And as I said, the NZAB has no vested interest, right? We're not lobbying for anything in particular. We're just passing along advice based on the best available research.
A further question to Dr. Donner. I'm deeply troubled by the most recent research that's come out on what's now estimated to be a 50-50 risk of the collapse of the Atlantic Meridional overturning circulation system, which has got to be the worst name for anything scary in the history of time. But could you, if you just talk directly to Canadians, what's at stake if we don't move quickly? And we're talking about science here. How would you explain that 50-50 risk of collapse of the Gulf Stream and the circulatory systems by mid-century to the average person?
Well, I'm going to say a couple of things. The first thing to know is that the projections for the future, what's going to happen over the next many decades, they are uncertain. And the number one driver of that uncertainty, and this is data that comes straight out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, I can pass along a figure if people would like. The number one driver of that uncertainty is the choices that people make. So which scenario we're going to be in, how high are our emissions going to be? And so it is really up to individual people, it's up to governments, but choices we make about the emissions we put up in the atmosphere and how much the planet's going to warm. That is the controlling thing on what our number one controlling thing on what our future is going to be. And some of the biggest risks that come with future climate change is the more the planet warms, the greater the risk of some sort of run-on or cascading feedback events, right? So some really disastrous things like a slowdown of the ocean circulation that Elizabeth May is mentioning, or other sort of severe impacts of run-on feedback events. I will say that the risk to the overturning circulation in the Atlantic, the risk is still fairly low that it could happen this century, and that it is something that's debated. Sometimes this is a case of a debate from within the scientific community popping up into the media, and then you only hear parts of it sometimes. And so I don't want to say that the risk of it is exaggerated, but maybe the statistics that people present on the likelihood sometimes gets pushed a little bit. It sounds a little bit more likely in the media than it does in a scientific meeting. But that doesn't change the fundamental issue here, that the choices we make are determining the climate for many generations to come. A molecule of CO2 you put up in the atmosphere, some of them are still going to be there in 10,000 years. This is a really permanent decision we're making, and that's why it's so important to act early.
Thank you. Kath Avra, if you could give advice to this government right now, and I think I have about less than a minute for your answer, what advice would you give if they were open to listening?
I would start with two things. Number one, keep existing environmental protections that we have. So Bill C-30 is currently being debated in the House, where we're talking about rolling back decisions made by Health Canada about potentially harmful toxic chemicals. Keeping those kinds of protections in place in this uncertain world that we're entering into that Simon Donner spoke about is absolutely critical. The second piece of advice, make a plan and tell Canadians about it. That's what the Net Zero Accountability Act is all about. It's about making a plan, transparently communicating that plan to Canadians.
Thank you very much, Ms. May. Je tourne maintenant à Monsieur Watchorn pour 6 minutes.
I'm now handing the floor to Mr. Watchorn for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you specifically to the Conservative side and the Green Party. I've never seen this in the past. I think it's very interesting that this is actually has actually been done, and I would like to applaud Elizabeth May today. I would like to congratulate her because it's her Saints' Day. Mrs. May, happy Saints' Day, and many happy returns. I would like to talk about prosperity. Dr. Donner, you talked about prosperity and how the country was going to become prosperous. Today we're very lucky and happy to have two experts with us who I hope will give their opinions on projects that Quebec holds dearly. And I would say that one of these projects is the Alto high-speed train. It was surprising today to listen to the head of the leader of the Bloc Québécois who said that he was against this project. I don't understand because it's very good for the climate. And I would like Dr. Donner's opinion on this. What about the electrified railway system in Canada? What do you think about this project?
Like the concept of the Major Projects Office. I like the idea that there are projects that are in the national interest that we need to put ahead. Those projects need to align with getting to net zero emissions. And so some of the things we need to do includes electrifying transportation, electrifying how we heat and cool our homes. And so the idea of an electrified rail line, I'm from Toronto originally. It sounds like a wonderful idea to have an electrified line going ideally from Windsor all the way to Quebec City. And I would say the plan that was put in place was probably too limited. As to why people would or would not support this, that's a debate for all of you to have amongst yourselves, and I don't want to be used as the sort of narrative device in that debate.
C'est très bien compris, Dr. Donner, puis je comprends très bien votre position là-dessus.
We've understood that, Dr. Donner, and we understand your position. But Mrs. Abreu, You've already talked about the electrification of the electrified railway system. What do you think about this concept of an electrified train between Quebec City and Toronto? And we've also heard about another project in Alberta. I think that the public transport systems that are electrified are one of the good things that we can do for the environment. What's your opinion about this, please?
The kind of competition that's happening between countries right now to become between petrostates versus electrostates, right? This idea that many of the emerging economies that are becoming most competitive globally these days are heading toward electrification. And indeed, with the annual UN climate talks coming up, Turkey has now put it on the agenda to talk about a global goal of increasing electrification by 35% by 2035. So this trend toward electrification, making use of Canada's clean energy resources to electrify our homes, our businesses, our transportation, is definitely a conversation that we need to be having. When it comes to specific projects, that conversation has to happen in context with the communities that are involved and might be impacted. But I think perhaps part of what you're raising here, from my perspective, is the need for us to be having conversations about these kinds of projects in Canada versus having the oldest, most boring conversation I can possibly imagine about how we're going to build another pipeline, which sucks up so much of the energy, the attention, and the political and financial resources in this country, preventing us from having these kinds of important conversations about projects that will actually be taking us forward.
Merci beaucoup pour votre opinion là-dessus. Un deuxième projet
Thank you very much. And the second project that's very dear to me is the Interconnection Electric project, which is part of the electrifying strategy of the government. So the project for Churchill Falls and Gull Island, which will allow us to have clean energy in Quebec over the next decades, and will also allow for more substantial, fair partnership between Newfoundland, Labrador, and Quebec. How do you perceive these great electrification projects? Are they a good way of using our energy strategy? Mrs. Abreu, could you answer, please? Thank you.
About better connecting the electricity grids across Canada, west to east, which is absolutely essential. We have far better connections north to south in Canada than we do across the country, and we need to have those connections east to west in order to balance the clean energy resources that we have across the country and serve those parts of the country that might not have those resources. I actually had the experience of cutting my teeth in Nova Scotia as the Muskrat Falls project was being developed, where I met Miss Medema. I slipped into using your first name earlier. My apologies, because we've got our history, Madam Chair. Thank you. I realized at that point that the interconnection and the clean electricity that project would provide, as long as the project was undertaken, this is Muskrat Falls that I'm talking about, with certain considerations in place, would be essential to helping to get that part of the country into a clean electricity scenario. I think there are other questions to be asked about the further developments of that project. Hydroelectricity has significant environmental implications and significant implications for the communities that surround those projects. And so, again, this is another area where some very robust conversation is needed between governments, workers, communities, to think about what projects are required to take us into that clean energy future and to grow our clean electricity grids.
Merci beaucoup pour la réponse.
Merci
également,
beaucoup, Monsieur Watchorn.
Merci.
Thank you for the answer. Now, Mr. Bonin, for 6 minutes, please. Chair, thank you very much, and thank you very much to our witnesses. Mr. Donor, could you tell us, according to you, whether Canada is on the right route in terms of the 2000 to 2035 targets and net zero objectives? Do you think we're going to reach that objective? Thank you. Thank you.
35 targets. No, Canada is not on pace to meet the targets. At this point, no analyses, even the analyses done by the federal government's own modelers would find that. I can't give you specific numbers because there's yet to be any really detailed modeling of the impact of the Canada-Alberta deal and the change in the industrial pricing system across the country as a result. But I can point to some previous numbers that might be helpful. So even modeling that the NZAB did, again, with the Canadian Climate Institute, found that we were looking at basically about a 19% reduction by the year 2030 with the existing policies in place. Now, some of those existing policies have since been weakened. It includes the methane target for 2030 has been lessened a little bit. We've seen changes in electric vehicle rules, et cetera. So it'd be unlikely we would even get to 19% reduction below 2005 levels. And that would mean less than half of the way to the less than 40% target. And that modeling is very similar to the result that's in the government's own 2025 progress report that was released in December for the emissions reduction plan. But I want to point out something else. The other people that do modeling on this are the Canadian Energy Regulator. If you look in the Canada Futures report that they put out, and their own modeling says that we're nowhere close to the 2030 target using, even with policies, they were in their modeling considering policies that have since been canceled. And they also model all the way out to 2050, and they find that, we're looking at somewhere, even with implementation of things that have been canceled, we'd only get to at most a 35% reduction by 2050. And so that is why I've been quite outspoken and was quite clear whenever I had the chance to with the government is you can't be saying these deals are still compatible with net zero by 2050. They're not. The deal is not compatible with it. And I think it's paramount for the government, just be honest with Canadians about this. If you're going to pass deals like this, be honest about the implications.
Madame Eber, l'ancien ministre de
Mrs.
l'Environnement.
Abreu, the former environmental minister, was comparing the current government to former governments, and they said that this government is going further than Stephen Harper's government. Do you agree with this opinion? Alors,
however, that we are seeing an evisceration of environmental protections across the board. So it's not just the what I observe as the contravention of the legal obligations under the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. It's also the discussion paper that was recently issued on getting major projects built, and that proposes some really significant undermining of some of Canada's longest-standing environmental laws and protections. And I think, this question of the extent to which we're willing to lose this infrastructure is not one that's being put to Canadians. I agree with Dr. Donner that transparently communicating to Canadians, this is a decision we're making, here's why, and here are the protections that you're going to lose as a result is critical. And we're not having that kind of open conversation. Instead, things are being obfuscated with misleading language, including claims that we will continue to meet our net zero goal when clearly that has been put out of reach with recent decisions, and with misleading language like decarbonized oil and gas, which is something that I hear this government say regularly and is actually just a complete contradiction in terms.
Et est-ce que vous considérez, je reviens à l'ancien ministre de l'Environnement qui a également dit que.
I'll go back to what the subject about the Minister of the Environment, and the minister said that the results for Canada on climate was running the risk of being worse than the result in the United States under Donald Trump. Is that do you have a similar opinion to this?
Canada is the only G7 country where emissions have actually gone up since 1990. The United States is also a G7 country. We've seen emissions in the United States drop by over 20% between 2005 and 2026. And emissions are actually, believe it or not, projected to continue declining in the United States even under Trump and the rollbacks to environmental and climate policy. And that's because they have locked into their economy a certain amount of transition. And so with the Inflation Reduction Act and the investments that were made into renewable and clean energy through the IRA, the transition to clean energy continues apace in the United States. And the increased investment in renewables versus fossil fuels continues apace in the United States. So yes, it is true that despite all the rhetoric we are hearing and despite the very damaging decisions that have been made by the U.S. government around environment and climate, they will continue to perform better than Canada in the next number of years.
Est-ce que ce sont les pires reculs en matière de lutte climatique.
So, in terms of, it's the worst result in terms of fighting for the environment. Is that the worst? Is it the worst? Has it been the worst over the past year?
Years. So there are, of course, other countries who have different kinds of resources to act on the crisis, who have different track records. But amongst Canadian peers in the G7, yes, our performance is the worst.
Merci, Monsieur Bonnet. We'll now turn to Mr. Johns for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your testimony, Ms. Abreu, and Dr. Donner as well, and for your courage, for standing up for, climate action. Canada won the Fossil of the Day award in 2025 at COP30. Do you think Canada will win again this year?
So my first COP was in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was struck. I actually never witnessed Canada getting a Fossil of the Day because they didn't get one in that entire decade between 2015 and 2025. Not because Canada was perfect, but because they were showing up in the international space openly, honestly, and with a constructive attitude. And because that was not the case in Brazil, Canada won the Fossil of the Day. Again, we will see how Canada's performance is spelled out at COP31 in Turkey, but I do expect, given the rollbacks in climate policy in Canada and the ongoing commitment to continue building fossil fuel projects, that Canada will indeed be on the slate for a Fossil of the Day in COP31.
You talked about our international partners leading with a low-carbon agenda. We'd see the European Union, they have got their carbon border adjustment mechanism. We were told that if we removed carbon pricing, that we would then pay the price there. Now, we've heard Liberals talk about this prosperity agenda. The Prime Minister comes in, calls this a prosperity agenda. Given the wildfires that we've seen in the last 5 years, kids being told they can't go outside, and what we're seeing in terms of the damage to the environment. Can you speak about what that prosperity agenda looks like and the impact on our economy, given our walk back on climate action?
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing billions and billions of dollars in damages from climate impacts across Canada every year. And those numbers and impacts are always mounting. My Canadian family is from Nova Scotia. I recall 2024, where that province entered a state of emergency 3 separate times, first for fire, then for floods, then for extreme weather. This is the case across the country. Canadians are feeling the impacts of climate change. And we are being forced into this false dichotomy between the environment and the economy, as if we can trade one off against the other, when in fact the two go hand in hand. What economy do we have in an environment that is not able to function and provide the ecosystem services that we rely on? I just think that it's an absolutely rhetorical position that Canadians are being put in, and these are the kinds of divisive politics that I was referring to in my opening statement. Let me talk about prosperity for a second. So in 2022, for the very first time, Canada decoupled greenhouse gas emissions from our GDP. This has been a hallmark of success for the United Kingdom and for the EU. Separating GHGs from GDP has been a huge part of their growth and prosperity and in the green economy in the last number of years. In 2024, we saw already that was stagnating, that the separation between GHGs and GDP in Canada was stopping. And I expect with the decisions that we've seen recently, that will only continue in that trend. So we're seeing that our most prosperous counterparts in other parts of the world have figured out how to make money while reducing emissions. If Canada can't do that, we're going to keep being stuck left behind.
Thanks. Ms. Abreu, you stated that the Net Zero Advisory Board wasn't informed of policy decisions underway, and you weren't asked to provide advice on those decisions. Can you identify the most significant decisions where the advisory body was excluded?
Yeah. So under the Net Zero Accountability Act, the Net Zero Advisory Body is mandated to be consulted when a climate plan is being developed. The so-called climate competitiveness strategy, noticeably missing the word plan, was developed, again, without consultation of Canada's Net Zero Advisory Body. Because it's not called a plan, we weren't necessitated or legally mandated to be consulted on those decisions. But obviously, all the decisions undertaken there unwound much of the policies that we had advised on in previous years. And it contravened the advice that we prepared preemptively, actually, as a new government was coming into place to say, hey, we get it, you might want to make some changes. Here are some suggested new pathways that we might consider. And so, again, that climate competitiveness strategy, we were not consulted on it, despite it looking much like a plan, but it isn't. And our advice on how to make changes without doing away with so much of the progress that had been made was not taken into account.
How much time?
5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Johns. We'll now turn to Mr. Millett for 5 minutes, please. Mr. Fanjoy? Okay,
Yes.
Mr.
Okay.
Fanjoy.
Okay, thank you, witnesses. I'd like to talk a bit about building retrofits. I know it's not the whole. There's a lot of things that go into addressing the climate challenge. This is one. Could you talk to me about what policies have been most successful that you've seen in other jurisdictions, or even the previous program here in Canada, in encouraging building retrofits? I'll start with you, Ms. Abreu.
So over the course of my career, I have witnessed several examples where a program was rolled out and then canceled kind of abruptly with celebrations of its success. And some of the programs that were being offered at the federal level to support building retrofits face, unfortunately, a similar story. They were canceled very abruptly with press releases that mentioned the great success that they had when they were in place. It's always a sad tale when those get rolled back. So I will say that the previous federal support that we had for building retrofits were making a difference. In particular, they were making a difference for renters, for lower income communities where it's more difficult, where it can be a lot more difficult for folks to access those kinds of programs. Again, I'll offer an example from my experience working in Nova Scotia, where we actually developed a standalone energy efficiency utility. That's one approach that I've seen that works very well for incentivizing these kinds of home and business-based retrofits and can create a huge workforce and train that workforce up. A lot of the conversation that we have to have is not just about making money in Canada, but it's also about creating jobs.
Could you weigh in on building retrofits?
Sure, happy to. I mean, what I can comment on is some of the work that the Net Zero Advisory body had done. Among the key things that we tried to advise the government on last year, and again, this is a report that I sent to the Prime Minister's office, that I sent to the Energy Minister's office, that I got no feedback on. They didn't request I offered a briefing. And on it, on behalf of the Net Zero Advisory body, among the modeling we did this work with the Canadian Climate Institute, was we looked at the industrial pricing system, how you could tighten it to make it work better, right? Which this deal that's been arranged has failed to do. But we also tested other policies that would make a lot of sense. So building programs, for example, British Columbia's zero carbon, here in British Columbia, the zero carbon step code is probably the state of the art for building codes. And so we tested what would happen if you adopted that across the country in the modeling and gave some advice around that. We also tested the idea of having consumer incentives for heat pumps, but particularly low income households, right? And those are in the models, and they were basically came at little economic cost to the government, but by 2035 with a pretty good bang for your buck in terms of emissions reductions. And again, this is advice that was there that, there was no conversation about, and there was no response from the government.
Now, in your opinion, would a program such as this help to engage the broader Canadian public in the importance of taking measures that are available to us to address climate change?
The way I always think about it is that there's a lot of people in Canada, if you look in the polls, that want to take action, want themselves to do something to reduce emissions and respond to climate change. But it's costly for them unless government sent the incentives right. And so better building codes is zero carbon step code, and certainly a program, particularly for low income households, to help get heat pumps installed. They are net financial winners in the long term. They also give you cooling in places like British Columbia and Vancouver here, where very few people have air conditioning, myself included. Those are really sensible policies that the government could be working on right now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to move the following motion. Pursuant to Standing Order 108, the Standing Committee on the Environment and Sustainable Development holds no less than 6 meetings to conduct a study on the opportunity for home energy and adaptation retrofits to improve energy efficiency, affordability, and resilience of Canadian homes, and the role of public policy in creating the conditions to realize these benefits, including the opportunity of home energy retrofits and adaptation measures in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing energy affordability, and fostering local economic and job growth. Accessibility of home energy and adaptation retrofits for low-income Canadians who are disproportionately impacted by high energy costs and climate change. Accessibility of home energy and adaptation retrofits for renters and landlords. Accessibility of home energy and adaptation retrofits in all types of communities and regions in Canada, including urban, rural, northern, Indigenous, and the barriers that impede Canadians from undertaking home energy and adaptation retrofits, including financing, program accessibility, supply chain limitations, workforce availability, and regional variations in housing stock. And that the committee present a report to the House on its findings and recommendations, and that pursuant to Standing Order 109, the committee requests that the government table a comprehensive response to the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fanjoy. I believe this was a motion that was on notice, so hopefully we can proceed quickly so we can continue with our witnesses. Mr. Leslie?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Parliament is ending for the session. I can't believe how gutless this is. To clearly you don't like the testimony that is happening in this place. You asked a question about the program, and it turned out that one of the witnesses went to the minister, was rejected, was rebuffed, and wouldn't even talk about it. And it turns out this entire program has always been delivered by Natural Resources Canada. It's not even under ECCC. This is something that, sure, if we want to talk about this in the fall, but for you to sit here, read out the entirety of the motion just to kill time is so shameless.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
I move to adjourn debate on this issue, Madam Speaker.
Right. All those in favor? There's no debate.
Madame la Présidente.
Oh, so we will vote on Mr. Leslie's...
Madame la Présidente.
Oh, Monsieur Bonnet?
Désolé, mais je pense que c'est quand même important de...
Yes, I think that we need to go back to what my colleague has just said from the Conservative Party. I think it's shameless that you take the witness statements of 2 experts on climate change who come and talk about how the Canada has having issues and could improve, and then you're laughing and you're taking additional time to avoid them saying anything and saying real things. And I think it's really lowly, and I'm very disappointed with your behavior. You've really reached the bottom of the bottom. Mr. Bonin, I apologize, but we cannot debate Mr. Leslie's motion.
Adjourn debate. So all those in favor of Mr. Leslie's motion to adjourn debate on this motion, raise your hands, please. And those opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
1, 2, 3, 4.
6.
5. Oh, and I didn't see Mr. Graves. You saw that
both,
one?
yeah.
Okay, so defeated.
So that's defeated. Mr. Leslie.
He's moved his motion. Somebody else has to be recognized.
Oh.
Yes. I'm just flabbergasted. What is there to debate on this issue? If you want to pass this, sure, go ahead. I understand that you don't appreciate the witness's testimony here. Oh, there's some other explanation as to why this would suddenly be moved just before the end of June, despite us having a private members bill that we're studying on the 16th and then coming back to immediately to clause by clause to finish. It is so transparent. It is shameless that you're trying to muzzle our witnesses. I would just ask for an immediate vote, pass this, whatever you think you need to do. You have your majority. You're going to do it anyways. Just because you don't like this testimony, this is something that I never thought I would see, and I thought you might do something like this in camera, but to be televised doing it is just embarrassing.
All right, any further debate on the motion? Mr. Fanjoy.
Yes, I need to respond to this.
It would take a long time, I bet?
No, you've taken the time. You've taken the time. I was using my time, and I don't think either of our witnesses need you to speak for them. I think that they would welcome this study. They would welcome it if it turns into ultimately into a program that helps us get to our numbers. So, this is a motion that's been on notice. Mr. Leslie, this entire past year, you have fought every single measure to address this issue. So you can get off your high horse.
Mr. Fanjoy, through the chair, please. Through the chair, please.
Yeah. So if there's no further debate, we'll go to a vote.
You have your hand up. Mr. Ross, to you.
Madam Chair, a motion on retrofitting for energy efficiency. When we're talking about it, and we hear it from government all the time, this is an existential crisis. Climate change, Paris Accord. And yet we have members who resigned from the Net Zero Committee coming to explain why they lost faith in the Climate Action Plan in Canada. I mean, we hear it all the time. This is one of the single biggest issues facing Canadians, if not our global partners, in talking about clean energy, fossil fuels, you name it. And what do? We waste time and muzzle our witnesses by a motion to look at heating efficiencies for houses. Is this really a big issue like what the governments have been saying for the last how many years? Or is this just an attempt to muzzle out our witnesses, giving what we see, as well as our colleagues down the way here, as extremely important witness testimony?
Shall we continue and do the vote so we can get back to our witnesses? All those in favor of Mr. Fanjoy's motion, please raise your hands. And those opposed? Okay, that carries. Thank you very much, Mr. Fanjoy. We will now turn to Monsieur Bonin pour 2.5 minutes. Merci.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair. Mr. Donor, you talked about risks for the Canadian economy, among other things. Could you tell us more about this in a situation in which we see that there's a change in the world on electrification with new technologies allowing for the reduction of the cost of energy, of oil, and the reduction of oil, gas? Is it more advantageous to move into electrification? If Canada does not take part in this world movement, would we end up maybe less competitive and behind, with high costs of living for households and with a high impact on the environment, or higher impacts on the environment?
Obviously I'm a scientist, natural scientist, not an economist, but because of working with the NZAB for so long, I followed the research on the economics and what's happening globally for the past 5-6 years. And one of the things that I think is just so important for Canadians, for everyone, here in the committee, but also for Canadians writ large to understand, is the conversation that we have in Canada, in the media, et cetera, about energy is divorced from the international conversation. And anyone who's attended an international climate conference and sat through a lot of sessions would see this. The International Energy Agency, which is a very conservative group that typically for years has overestimated, their fossil fuel projections have overestimated fossil fuel demand. In their scenario that's on stated policies, they have oil demand peaking by 2030, and they have gas demand peaking by 2035. Now, that is just based on existing policies that governments have going on around the world. That was from last year. It does not include the impacts of the war. And as I've mentioned, they tend to overestimate fossil fuel use. That is the reason that bodies like the NZAB were warning that an over-reliance on oil and gas and trying to, for the future of Canada is going to be a risk. Like trying to make the major projects heavily reliant on like a pipeline or new natural LNG facilities, they risk all being stranded assets. And it's not just an economic issue, it's a jobs issue because we make people's lives dependent on something that isn't maybe going to survive going forward. When I was a student back in the 1990s, when I was first in graduate school, which I started in the mid-90s, and I was studying climate change, we were told that solar and wind, I'll pause there. I'll just say that there's a revolution on clean energy going on, and Canada is not a part of it, and it's a problem.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bonin. We'll now turn to Miss May for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. May. Mrs. May.
With Mr. Johnson. Thank you. I want to go back to some of the key points that, and thank you again, Ms. Weber, for your very clear statements that Canada is not doing as good a job as the Trump administration, that the Climate Accountability Act is being ignored. Given what you've experienced, do you think there's any point in keeping the Climate Accountability Act, or should we just let it be repealed so Canadians know the truth?
Absolutely important to have national legislation that enshrines our long-term climate goals as well as a climate governance regime. That being said, while it's not being respected, communication around why that legislation is not being respected is absolutely paramount, and we are not getting that kind of honest and transparent communication with Canadians. So I would not recommend certainly repealing this legislation. I, in fact, am here to stand up for this legislation. It is absolutely critical, and as I mentioned, we are not a front-runner country when it comes to having this legislation. We were, 59th to pass our climate law, and so already we were out of step with many of our global peers, and eliminating a climate law, particularly when we announced a climate emergency in 2019, would actually just make us embarrassing on the global stage. I will say, when it comes to the damages that Canada is experiencing for climate change, according to the studies of the Canadian Climate Institute, by 2025, the Canadian economy was being slowed by $25 billion annually because of climate impacts. It is a huge impact to the Canadian economy, and not something that we can ignore. Nor can we ignore the shrinking market share that Canada has in the global clean energy economy that is only growing.
So again, to you, Ms. Burrows, the climate, as you said, that there's a global energy revolution happening. Dr. Donner said the same thing. Canada's not part of it. Are we in a very small group of countries that are still defending and willing to subsidize fossil fuels? Are we putting ourselves outside of what is now an increasingly global norm, in your view?
So fossil fuel subsidies, unfortunately, continue around the world. We see, in particular, fossil fuel subsidies for consumption in many parts of the world. And this is to offset the increasing costs of fossil fuels that people on the ground in many countries are experiencing because fossil fuels markets are becoming increasingly volatile. We are one of a number, I wouldn't say a tiny number, but still a relatively small number of countries that are offering the amount of subsidies that we do on production. I'm not sure that Canada would necessarily count itself amongst those other countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and, of course, the United States. We are certainly falling out of step with many of our global peers when it comes to really taking advantage of the transition. I will point out that Canada has a unique advantage. We have an incredible abundance of clean energy in this country that we are not taking advantage of. Instead, we obsess over this one industry that, yes, is important, and we need to plan for a managed phase out of that industry over many years with respect to workers and communities. But let's invest in the resources that we have in this country, and those are clean energy resources.
Thank you. Ms. Abreu, the Prime Minister was elected just over a year ago, and he was elected as a climate champion. He served as the UN Special Envoy on climate action, leading global net zero initiatives. This was his pedigree. Do you believe that he is betraying what he got elected on and his pedigree and the work that he had been doing prior to being Prime Minister?
My solidarity with the many of us who had much higher expectations for this Prime Minister coming into office, seeing his commitment to climate in other arenas, and having read his book. I think many of us are experiencing that disappointed appointment not only around climate policy, but I'll say as someone growing up in Canada, even if I set my concerns around climate change aside, I'm concerned that we are not having the conversation about where we want to prioritize future opportunities in this country. We've been having the same conversation the entire time that I've been in my professional career. It's sad. Like, it's just, I don't know. I just have to be really honest with you all about that. Like, it feels like we were just stuck in the same conversation over and over again. And even if I put my concerns for climate aside, the fact that we're not actually transitioning our economy into the future really worries me. And I think that in particular is what many of us are disappointed about, because we felt that this Prime Minister would be the right one to think through the options at the intersection of economic potential and clean economy potential in this country, and that's not what we're seeing.
Thank you very much, Ms. May and Mr. Johns. Now over to Mr. Millett for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I just wanted to thank our witnesses for appearing today. And I want to thank our Conservative friends as well for giving their time to Mr. Johns and Ms. May. I guess they're embracing their true commitment to climate change mitigation and environmental champion by allowing other voices at the table. So welcome, and I welcome your questions. My question, I guess, my first question is for Ms. Brew. What institutional changes would make the advisory board more effective, in your estimation, in providing independent advice to the government?
Well, the first step is to actually appoint members to the body. I believe there are still only 4 members who are currently on the body out of a maximum of 14. So definitely actually having some human resources there would be essential. As Dr. Donner already mentioned, investing in making sure that the right co-chairpersonship is there is really important. I know that Dr. Donner will have further observations to share as the former co-chair, but there's also so in other iterations of this kind of dynamic that we see in other countries, the level of autonomy that the Climate Council has is really critical. That's autonomy both in terms of resourcing, so the ability to oversee its own research and activities budget, as well as the level of autonomy of its staff. And I think, as Dr. Donner mentioned in his opening statement, we experienced the difficulty of having a staff that, was sometimes being put in a challenging position in terms of their role with government. So those would also be areas that a new structure would have to look at for the advisory body to be more effective.
Okay, thank you. And my next question would be for Dr. Donner then. During your time on the Net Zero Advisory Board, what recommendations, Dr. Donner, do you believe had the greatest impact on federal climate policy?
During my time on the Net Zero Advisory Board, honestly, it's a bit hard to answer precisely because of the timing of our advice. A lot of what we were advising on was aiming at very long-term policy, like long-term decisions. There weren't necessarily things that are being done in immediate policy. I would say the one time in which we lined up, I think, quite closely with the government because of planning from the government standpoint was on advice towards the 2035 target and advice towards what could be done to close the gap towards 2030. That was our second annual report. Most of the advice that we gave was not taken, but it was discussed in great detail with the government. It was discussed in great detail with the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. It was discussed in great detail with the Privy Council office, and that's because of the coordination. And that's why I pointed to the importance of coordination in my statement. Another thing that I will point out is that we worked a lot on industrial policy and industrial strategy. And I know that in the previous government, there was a lot of interest from outside of ECCC in the advice we were giving, and the previous co-chairs met with many people outside of ECCC about that advice. And again, it wasn't directly adopted, but it did, I think, influence some of the direction that the government took. And that's why I point to, y'all don't have to like me personally, but we're just doing research and giving advice, and why not listen to the experts? They're actually there working for the government. Serving at the pleasure of the government. It's worth listening to it.
Dr. Donner, I don't dislike you personally, and I want to make that clear. So do I have time for one more question? Yes. My last question then would be for Ms. Abreu. We just heard Dr. Donner talk about the long game, I guess, if you will, of the recommendations that the advisory body had made. Would you agree with me, though, that you painted a bit of a bleak picture by painting us versus the USA in terms of the progress that they're making? But is that not a bit of a false narrative? Because we go back, I guess, to the Obama, even back to, I guess, the Bush era, when they started laying the groundwork for this, and with the commitment and the ability and the sheer heft, if you will, of the U.S. to enact some of these, and the California climate regulations, which are not insignificant. That is all catching on now. And to compare it, I guess my point is it's a bit of a false narrative, would you not agree, to compare all of those years of planning and that stewardship by progressive presidencies is now coming to fruition, yet we're being compared to Donald Trump of all people. So do you agree it's a little bit unfair to do that?
A short answer, please, Ms. Abreu.
I don't agree that it's unfair to do it, because if we were not making that comparison, then we would be saying that it was okay for previous successive governments in Canada not to take any action on climate change, which was not the case. It was not okay. And in fact, we now have a decade of revolution in Canadian climate policy behind us. And so what I'm talking about is how this government will plan to continue that legacy. And currently, there is no plan to continue any of that activity. Instead, there's just elimination of policies without any new pathways being put forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Millett. So on behalf of the committee, I would like to very warmly thank our witnesses for their time and testimony today. You are now excused, and we'll suspend for a few minutes while we switch to in-camera. Thank you.
you.